On this Aircheck episode, we continue our session with Atlanta's Steve Craig. Steve hosts the morning show on 97.1 The River.
This is part 3 of 4. Steve tells the tale of a lucky listener who won a contest to have Foo Fighters play in their garage, how he started his radio career, and a few encounters with fame along the way, including with one of his radio idols, the real Don Steele.
Here we go.
Welcome to Aircheck Season 4, a podcast about radio's personality from radio personalities, managers, consultants, owners, and your most humble hosts from Philadelphia, Rich DeSisto and Paul Kelly.
I'm Rich DeSisto.
And I'm Paul Kelly.
This is part 3 of a 4-part series with Steve Craig. And when we last spoke with Steve, he recounted the tragic day of the Olympic bombings in Atlanta, July of 1996.
Jill Mellinson, who was our night person, was there live on the air, and she literally had the mic open and she was doing a talk set, and all of a sudden you heard this.
We learned about how the end of Atlanta's 99X created a new beginning at a new radio station in New York City, New York's WRXP.
Everybody in and around the industry said, no, rock doesn't work in New York. It just does not work. And Dan and a few of the other guys, Brian Schock, who was involved in programming of the station, Jimmy Steele, a lot of these industry guys told us, no, we're going to prove them wrong. We're going to make it work.
Ladies and gents, it's Steve Craig. You could almost call RXP there in New York the long-lost step twin of 99X in Atlanta.
Yes.
With the staff that you had in place, the energy, the promotions, Foo Fighters in somebody's garage in Yonkers. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, that was amazing. That was a contest that we kind of spearheaded. It was a little bit of a national one, but we kind of took it under our wing because it was New York. And Matt Pinfield was the host, and we all came out there and kind of helped with some of the interviews and got everything all set up. Literally, this guy won a contest to have Dave Grohl and Foo Fighters, the full band, play in his garage for his neighbors.
Those people just won $300 million in Albany. They got $16 million each. They don't have the Foo Fighters put in their garage. I'll take $16 million, but but you know what? To tell you the truth, I'd rather have this.
And then they limited the crowd to like a certain amount of radio winners. We had, I think, 25 or 30 people that we invited in, and literally they came out and invaded the neighborhood and set up in the garage.
There's a better rock and roll band in the world. Fuck, there isn't. I think you should introduce us every night, Doc. That's the best introduction we've ever had. Fuck, there isn't.
Even as Dave they were doing the set, and after the interviews, he came in and he was meeting everybody, talking with everybody, and he noticed that as they were performing, there were some these big giant hams that are hanging from the rafters in the garage, curing. So he goes, "Why is there meat hanging from the ceiling?" And then you see Taylor Hawkins in the back, the drummer, where he was set up. Every once in a while, he would kind of lean over and he would open up the fridge right behind him. And he'd grab like a couple of beers. He'd pass some beers around. The guy's going, "Hey, those are my beers." He goes, "It's mine now." And it was so much fun. And it was sonically incredible. The guys, they were having such a great time. I do have some video on that whole show from my perspective. And talk about, you always dream about being up close and personal with a band. Oh my God, we were we were high-fiving the guys in between licks. It was that incredible. And that just never happens again. That's Dave Grohl. I mean, that's the kind of guy he is. And that's the kind of guy the guys that are in that band.
Well, right now I'm picturing the garage scene in basketball when Trey Parker and Matt Stone are having their competition in their driveway. I'm picturing that garage. But for anybody that's not familiar with what Yonkers, New York, and a neighborhood looks like, tell us what Yonkers, New York is.
It's very suburban. It was a very suburban, this almost a very different than your typical New York, Brooklyn or even Queens. It seemed like it was a little bit spread out. I mean, it was a normal looking neighborhood, really. The house was like down the end of a little cul-de-sac that we had to, cordon off with a bus and police and everything, and people worrying, what's going on? And then this band is ripping the neighborhood apart.
Steve, I'm originally from Yonkers, and this part of the city where you had the Foo Fighters show sounds a little more upscale than where we moved away from in 1974. And Van Cortlandt Park Avenue still hasn't changed a bit. But those New York roots introduced me to my radio influences, New York and Philly, due to the geography where we actually ended up moving to in Central Jersey. But what about you, Steve? Where did it all start for you? When did you get the radio bug?
Oh, God. I was hanging out at a little radio station. I had a friend of mine who was one of the guys who was on the promotional team. He drove the van at KEZY in Anaheim, California.
KEZY, your hometown radio station. It's 1227 here in Orange County, and I'm Mother D.
Down the street from Disneyland. And so we used to pretty much hang out at the radio station. You know, we had talked about doing a punk rock show, and I had a whole bunch of punk records and say, hey, would you want to do maybe a punk rock show? And I go, no, I've never done radio before. And so they had a guy who was, going to do the show. And so I was kind of supplying him the records, and I kind of went on and kind of co-hosted. And so they had what I would consider still one of the first punk rock radio programs in Southern California, because this is 1978. It lasted, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. Like midnight on a Saturday night or whatever, nobody could hear it, and people were complaining about it because the music was just so punky. But at that point, one of the guys at the station said, hey, we have a broadcast workshop here. Would you be interested in joining that? I went, sure. So I just jumped into the disc jockey school that the radio station had. The good thing about it is they taught you all the different aspects of radio, but you learned from the guys who were actually on the air. You learned from the salespeople. You learned from the engineer. These are guys who really, really know exactly what they were doing at the time. From that point, I got my first gig in Lompoc, California, and these are what they used to call starter stations. And I just put my little air check that I had made at KEZY and sent it off and got the gig. And it's a little daytime radio station, meaning you had to sign off at night. When the sun went down, you had to turn the radio station off because it goes into a technical thing and whatever. So the old daytime AM radio stations. I was 3 months into that gig, thought I was king of the hill, and Boston had a brand new album out called Don't Look Back. And so the new single from that was the song, the title track, Don't Look Back. And so we were playing that in our little new category. And we were spinning records then too. They were 45s. So I think sunset was going to be like at maybe 5:30 that day or 6:30, whatever. So I'm the afternoon guy. So 6:30 rolls around. It might've been 6:29. So I decide I'm going to play the Boston song and let it play out. And it's about a 6-minute record. And so all of a sudden it goes out, and I'm like 5 minutes past sign-off time, and we finally shut down. But apparently the owner was listening, and he would have none of that. And so I was fired for playing a Boston record. So I blame Boston for. And it was such a wonderful song, and I had to get it in. So that cost me my first gig.
Oh, Steve, don't look back.
I know.
You're listening to Season 4 of Air Check, a podcast about radio's personality from radio personalities. Rich and Paul have lined up another roster of guests just as compelling as Seasons 1, 2, and 3. Air Check Season 1 includes conversations with Eddie Trunk, Danny Bonaducci, Nina Blackwood, and more. Air Check, available now on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also tell your smart speaker to play Air Check Podcast.
So along the radio road, you've had plenty of celebrity encounters, whether they be studio interviews or out on the street at a remote location. You had one that, turned up your nose a little bit. Tell us about and who Pat Buttram is.
This is the second gig of my career in Barstow, California. A lot of people who maybe have been to Vegas know Barstow. It's the halfway point between LA and Vegas. You literally stop there, grab some McDonald's, and fill up your tank, and that's Barstow's existence. But they had a little radio station, KIOT, K131. Again, it was a little daytime station. I was doing mornings and a little bit of middays there, morning news and middays. And we had an owner who was really into the old Westerns. In fact, he was dating a woman who was an old Roy Rogers co-star in all those old B Westerns that they used to shoot out in the high desert there near around Barstow and that area. And so he was one of these kind of Western kind of guys. And so we had his buddy, Mr. Haney, Pat Buttram, out doing an appearance.
Haney Telephone Company, good morning.
Oh, hello, Mr. Haney. How's it going?
Just fine. Is there anything else you want to know?
No.
Then I'll just put you down for 50 cents.
What for?
You ask how everything was going, and that comes under the heading of information, and all information calls are 50 cents.
How can you charge 50 cents for information?
It'll cost you another 50 cents for the information on how I can charge 50 cents for information.
Get me,
Mr. Haney likes to drink a bit. When the promotion was done and Pat Buttram was 5 sheets to the wind, Ray Webb, who was our owner, says, "Hey, Steve, he says, I want you to take Pat home. Go ahead and drive him home to Los Angeles, and he'll tell you, he'll give you directions and everything. Here's my keys. Take my car." And he had this big white convertible Cadillac, which I thought, hey, I'm going to take this. Here's a Hollywood star. I'm going to take in this convertible white Cadillac and drive into Hollywood. So I thought that was going to be a really good idea. So we got over the pass and into LA, and he had slept most of the way. And so I kind of had to, prod him and say, hey, wake up. We're on the 405. Where do I go? Well, let's. And I realized that he'd already peed his pants. He'd already completely let loose. All over Ray's nice red interior, and it was just a mess. And so he says, well, wait, pull over here first. Pull on over here. And he wanted to go to a bar. And so I went, okay, fine. So I pulled over and parked, and he got out and stumbled into the bar, and he was in there for about maybe a half hour, 40 minutes, came back out again. And he gave me the address, and I had my little Thomas Brothers map, and I'm looking. I kind of knew where he was. And so he says, okay, well, I'll just go ahead and take let's go home. And I found his place. I had to wake him up again. I finally found his apartment, and I got him upstairs. Kind of it's a little bit of a sad thing, because this is a guy that was on Green Acres, and he was on a lot of Western movies as the comic sidekick and whatever. But in his apartment, I remember when I took him in, he had literally an entire corner of his apartment. It was huge. It was about as tall as me, of just letters, and it looked like unopened fan mail, just a bunch of letters to him. And I thought that was kind of sad, really. But that was my first celebrity encounter in radio.
What about any of your idols or mentors in broadcasting? Did you ever cross paths with any of those?
Oh, gosh, real Don Steele. When I grew up in Southern California, a lot of people might not know what Boss Radio was back in the 60s. And that was these guys who were, they were fast-talking DJs. They had, it was all about the DJ. It wasn't so much the songs. The songs were like 2.5 minutes long, but it was all about the DJs and the presentation. And the real Don Steele was on KHJ in LA, and he was just larger than life. He was one of these guys. It was like 93 KHJ, it's the real Don Steele. It's 24, and I'm banging my head on the console. And he would just do these weird. It was just crazy.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, the real Don Steele.
KHJ Los Angeles.
301 in Los Angeles. Happy holiday, happy 4th of July. Drive carefully out there, be independent. Bang, 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 bang.
But that's what we loved in the 60s, and KHJ did Boss Radio like no other station did. And so I'm working in Southern California, and I got a job doing weekends on the Oldies channel on TransStar Networks. And they were based in Hollywood, so I was like, wow, I got the Hollywood gig. And so I was working weekends, and it was early syndication satellite kind of thing, where you would do a radio show from the studio. And then when you would do a break, you would hit the big red button, and that would fire off all these custom call letters that you would have to sit in a studio for literally 3 or 4 hours and pre-record these and send them off to other stations around the country.
And this would identify the other stations that were part of that network.
Exactly. Yeah. So you were doing a live show, but then it was kind of placed into the framework of these other stations with their call letters and their taglines and so forth. But one of the guys who was on the Oldies channel was the real Don Steele. And he every once in a while would pull a weekend shift, and so I was finishing up and he was coming in next, and it was like, I get to meet my idol. And his headphones I mean, his headphones were like something like, I mean, they were like huge because he was just so deaf. But great guy. I mean, but he was, again, one of those radio guys who never ever could turn it off. I mean, he walked up and go, "Hey, how you doing? It's the Real Don Steele. Nice to meet you. Great to have you on board. You sound great." And then it was just, it was just amazing. I think I did 2 back-to-back shifts with him for the time that I was there, but larger than life guy. But I mean, but really, really nice. And make sure you have my first hour pulled for me. All right.
And for those that aren't in the radio business, tell us what that means.
Well, we were at the time we were playing carts.
What's a cart?
When we would go from like my first couple of gigs, we were playing records. You know, they're like 45s, and you were hoping to God you had the right speed when you queued up your record. Kind of like, WKRP in Cincinnati, that kind of thing. It's exactly the way it was, except the one thing I hated about that show is we wore headphones and Howard Hessman didn't. But from records, we went to carts or cartridges, and they basically looked like 8 tracks. If you remember what 8 tracks looked like, but they would have, just one song on it or one commercial, whatever. But there were just walls and banks of these cartridges, or carts, we call them. And you just pop those into the cart machines and hit your button and the song would play. And this is before CDs, of course. And then once CDs came out, then they had CD players that we were using along with the carts. And now it's all digital. Now it's just, MP3 files or WAV files, and you push a button and it fires up. But when what you had to do is you had to pull your music before you went in. So you had to sit there and look at your format sheet and go, okay, I pull this one, here's the number, I gotta pull this one, I gotta pull this one, gotta pull this one. And so you always customarily pulled the next hour for the jock who was coming on for you. So yeah, the Real Don Steele goes, "Make sure you pull my music."
I think we used to pull 2 hours of music for the next jock, right, Paul?
2 hours of music and the next few hours of commercials, too.
On our final episode with Steve, part 4 of 4, Steve talks about his return to Atlanta at 97.1 The River after his time at WRXP in New York City. His love of being a pilot, and the story how he was one of the first private pilots to fly post 9/11 as he was involved in transporting the Red Cross blood donations, and his involvement with what turned out to be the first radio station website in 1994.
Every episode of Air Check is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Follow us to be alerted when new episodes are released. You can also tell your smart speaker to play Air Check Podcast. If you haven't done so, give us a great rating. We'd also love to hear from you on our Facebook page, Air Check Me.
This is Rich DeSisto.
And I'm Paul Kelly.
We'll talk to you soon.
Closing out another episode of Air Check, a podcast about radio's personality from radio personalities. If you have radio stories to share, we'd love to hear from you. Join the Air Check guest list. Email aircheckme@gmail.com. Musical props are Chris Gordon's. Announcer props, I'll take those. Greg O'Brien, the OB. Air Check is available now on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also tell your smart speaker to play Air Check Podcast. Air Check is the creation of RDPK Productions.